Let's now define what exactly Flexbox is and when and why we need it, and also talk about some important terminology around Flexbox, and finally also get an overview of all the properties that are part of the Flexbox specification. So a one-line definition of Flexbox is that it is a set of related CSS properties that we can use to build one-dimensional layouts. Now, when Flexbox was developed a couple of years ago, the main idea behind it was to basically allow browsers to automatically divide empty space inside some container element by its child elements. And by doing that, the browser takes away a lot of work that previously the web developers had to do. So by defining manually width and stuff like that, so a bit like we did in our last coding challenge. So with Flexbox, all of that would happen automatically. Now Flexbox also makes it extremely easy to automatically align items to one another inside a certain parent container. And that is true both horizontally and vertically. And in fact, we already saw that working a little bit in the previous lecture, right? And so with this, Flexbox solves a couple of very common problems in CSS development, such as vertical centering and also creating equal height columns. So these used to be hard problems before Flexbox came along, but now with modern CSS, these are very, very simple to solve. And so since you are learning CSS only now with these modern technologies already in place, you will never know how difficult this used to be. So consider yourself very lucky by that. So basically what I just said is that Flexbox is perfect for replacing the old school floats. And by that, it allows us to write fewer and also cleaner HTML and CSS code, which of course is very easy to maintain websites over the long run and to write less bugs. Okay, so now that we know what Flexbox is exactly and what problems it helps us solve, let's talk a little bit about some important terminology. And actually, there are not many concepts behind Flexbox that you need to understand in order to start using it. But here is what you do need to know. So first of all, the element on which we want to use Flexbox is called the Flex container. So just as I mentioned in the last lecture as well. And all we have to do in order to create a Flex container is to set its display property to Flex, and that's it. That's how we get started with Flexbox. So if we do this, then all the direct children of that Flex container will become the so-called Flex items. And this is actually important to know and to keep in mind, because we will use different properties on the Flex container and on the Flex items. Now, the direction in which these Flex items are laid out is called the main axis, which is represented with this arrow here. Then, the other perpendicular axis is simply called the cross axis. And it's important to know about these names because we can actually change the direction of the main axis and so therefore also of the cross axis. Plus, we can align elements along the main axis and along the cross axis in different ways, and therefore we always need to know which axis we are dealing with. So try to keep these concepts in mind so that you can fully understand how the different Flexbox related properties work. And actually, that's what we're going to talk about next. So in this slide, before we actually move to the practice part, I want to show you an overview of all the CSS properties that are part of the Flexbox specification, both for the Flex container and for the Flex items. So for the Flex container, the most important ones are the gap, the justify content, and the align items properties. And in fact, we already talked about two of them in the last lecture, right? Now, I'm not going to go over all the details here. Just know that the first value that is in bold is the default value, and then the other ones are the possible options that we can specify. And then also you have a very short description of each of the properties. And so my hope is that you can use this slide kind of as a cheat sheet to print out or to create a print screen image that you can always have handy when you are working with Flexbox. I actually did this in the very beginning when I started learning Flexbox, and it was really, really helpful because it is in fact impossible to know all of these properties by heart at all times and also know exactly what they do. So again, I think it would be a great idea to print out this slide and keep it as a cheat sheet close to your keyboard or whatever you use on your working space. But anyway, there are 3 other properties that we can apply on the Flex container element, which are Flex Direction, Flex Wrap, and Align Content. And actually, some of these, especially number 5 and 6, are used for pretty advanced Flexbox techniques that we will not study in this course because I think they are a bit too confusing for beginners. So in this course, which is more of a beginner CSS course, my goal is just that you really understand the fundamentals of Flexbox and are able to use them on your own. And with these fundamentals, trust me, you can solve 99% of all the most common scenarios. But now moving on a bit to properties that we can apply on the Flex items themselves. One of them is Align Auto, which is pretty important because this can basically override the Align Items property. Then we have these other ones, which are Flex Grow, Flex Shrink, Flex Basis, and these 3 together, so 2, 3, and 4, form the Flex property. So as you can see below number 5 there, Flex is the recommended shorthand for Flex Grow, Flex Shrink, and Flex Basis. Okay, and again, we will go over them a little bit later in this section once we actually can start using them in practice. Finally, there is also the order property, which we can use to basically change the order of the Flex items visually on the page without changing their order in the source code. Okay, but enough talking now. Let's now move back to code and start learning many of these properties one by one.